I got to have these incredible experiences of working with not only astronauts, but cosmonauts. And I got to work with, you know, not only the American Space Agency, NASA, but with the Canadians and the Europeans and the Japanese and the Soviets and then the Russians. And so I had this fantastic experience, and it was candidly not very high paying, but it was extremely rewarding.
Hello and welcome to Venturing Beyond. Today we have with us Julianne Zimmerman, the Managing Director of Reinventure Capital, who is passionate about putting technology and capital to work for the greater good. Reinventure Capital is a high-impact, high-return venture practice investing exclusively in U.S. companies led by BIPOC and all-women founders. Julianne created and teaches a course called Innovative Social Enterprises in Tufts University. She's also taken on roles as a trusted mentor, co-founder, board member, advisor, consultant along her journey, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing directly from her about her varied experiences. So, without further ado, welcome Julianne. Thank you so much for being here. I'm really excited for our conversation.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm thrilled to join you.
And before we begin, how are you? Please introduce yourself briefly. I'd love to hear about what you've been working on, any projects or interests or hobbies.
Oh gosh, well, I'm in Boston presently, or actually right now I'm just outside Boston, and we're well here. I'm primarily still going to be working from home, like I think many people, for the next few months at least. But we are really busy with Reinventure. As you mentioned, I teach at Tufts, and the term ended in late May. So that is not part of my current activity slate at the moment, but Reinventure is very busy. We are actively investing, as you mentioned, and we have 3 companies in our current portfolio. We have 2 active deals on the table and another one that is close to being ready to pursue. And then we have a huge amount of active deal flow behind that. At the same time, we are still concluding our fundraise for the fund. So we have 3 concurrent fields of endeavor right now with Reinventure. So that's quite busy, which, as you can imagine, leaves not very much time for hobbies. But I'm very fortunate to have 2 beautiful dogs who keep me somewhat grounded. And I'm a very avid reader. So I'm always reading and listening to at least 2 or 3 books at a time.
What kind of dogs do you have?
We have 2 Akitas. It's a Japanese breed. They're very large, very furry dogs, and they're fantastic companions.
Brilliant.
They're very content to be just close to us all the time. I get to walk them every morning, which gives me a little bit of fresh air and a little bit of quiet and an opportunity to notice what's happening in the world outside my computer.
You did mention books and you like listening to them as well. Do you have any recommendations or like a recent read that you found super interesting?
I read a lot for work, and my reading for work, as you can imagine, is very much along the lines of racial and social and gender equity, and particularly in the world of finance. So, for example, I strongly recommend Edgar Villanueva's Decolonizing Wealth. But the reading I mentioned before is really recreational reading to give me a break and to give my mind a different way of engaging. And so I listen to and read a lot of speculative fiction. And I particularly like literary fiction. So I love Eastern European and Japanese fiction. I love Haruki Murakami, for example. I love Nnedi Okorafor. I love Anne Leckie. I love Martha Wells. There are so many fantastic writers. It really is a joy to give my mind some refreshment.
I took environmental studies in college, right, as a subject, and there was a lot of reading, and I'm very much interested in the subject, so I love reading about it, but it's a little depressing.
It's very heavy. It's very heavy work. It's important, and also I was just having this conversation with a colleague the other day. It's that much more important if you are undertaking such really grave work to make time, to make opportunities in your day to experience joy. It's important for all of us to experience joy, but it's especially important when you are taking on these really big challenges to be intentional about recognizing the need for joy and finding it and savoring it and valuing it as an important part of your life.
And it kind of re-emphasizes why it's so important. Like everything's discouraging you and the problem itself seems so much bigger, like out of your control.
Absolutely. And to help you stay human, right? You're still a person. You're not just someone who's doing work.
Yeah,
right?
That's very true.
And it's really important to remember that, especially when, as you say, it's very tempting to be sucked into working more or less nonstop. That's not a healthy thing.
Yeah, truly. Actually, you mentioned in your bio, and I read about how you're passionate about putting technology and capital to work for the greater good. Would you mind explaining what you mean by that?
Yeah, I'm happy to. It took me several years into my career to be able to formulate that statement. It was always part of my motivation, but it took me a while to figure out how to articulate it. I grew up in a fairly rural part of Pennsylvania, which is in the mid-Atlantic part of the United States. It's a part of the country that is, well, when I was a child at least, it was mostly farms and woods. And I grew up with a real appreciation of the outdoor world, and also somehow or another I got it into my head as a child that I wanted to be an astronaut. So when I was 16, I went to MIT to study aeronautical engineering because I thought that was how you became an astronaut, or it was one of the ways I thought you could become an astronaut. And that was very much about throwing myself into this career path that I thought was one of the most extraordinary ways to advance human knowledge. And I was very naive at 16, but nevertheless, it wasn't the worst idea. And in fact, I was also a very avid reader from a very young age, and I double majored in literature. And one of the things that I learned very early on from that experience was that for a lot of people, including my academic advisor, that made no sense whatsoever. And I'm so glad that I did it, because it gave me not only, again, that rounding experience of being human, not just being, focused on my engineering studies, but it also has given me different ways to think about problems as I've gone through the various incarnations of my career. So back to our story. I had a fantastic first career working in manned spaceflight exploration, or human spaceflight exploration, it was really a wonderful adventure. I got to work with scientists all over the world. I worked in a really tiny company in Cambridge, Massachusetts. I was employee number 7, and this is in the 1980s when that was not a normal thing to do. And again, many people thought that was a very strange choice. The aerospace industry is, as everyone said at the time, an industry that's dominated by giants, and why on earth would you go to this tiny little company? But I had a fantastic experience, and my team and I were able to do things that would never have been possible at large corporations. And in fact, many people told us were flatly impossible. And so I had this fantastic experience. I really did get to be involved in advancing scientific research. But I got to have these incredible experiences of working with not only astronauts but cosmonauts, and I got to work with not only the American Space Agency, NASA, but with the Canadians and the Europeans and the Japanese and the Soviets and then the Russians. And so I had this fantastic experience, and it was candidly not very high paying, but it was extremely rewarding because I really felt that the work that I was doing had intrinsic value. And I did get to be a finalist twice in the NASA astronaut selection process. And ultimately, I was not selected. So it was both a signal highlight of my career and also a heartbreak, all at the same time. And it gave me an opportunity to think about what else would I care about as much. Did I want to stay in that field? Did I want to continue doing that work? Or did I want to find other ways to do work that I felt was equally intrinsically valuable? And I remembered that, again, growing up, I had very much valued my experience of the outdoor world. And I was also a child at the beginning of the Earth Day movement. So conservation was very much part of my kind of consciousness or my awareness from a very young age. And so I started looking around for opportunities to bring my engineering skills to bear in the conservation realm. And what I discovered in the early 2000s is that there really wasn't a lot of technology development or innovation being done to prevent or reduce or mitigate the creation of effluents and other pollutants, persistent compounds as wastes into the environment. There was mostly work being done on remediation and cleanup, so after the fact. And so I thought that was peculiar. And so I ended up co-founding a company with a colleague that was an emissions to biofuels company. It was one of the first. And again, we were told by many people that this was not a thing. Many people told us, for example, no one in their right mind will ever invest in clean energy. And fortunately, those people turned out to be wrong. Yes, exactly. But again, I found that I was really just profoundly motivated by this opportunity to, again, bring my skills to bear to do work that I felt was intrinsically valuable. If we could be successful in reprocessing even a fraction of smokestack emissions into co-fireable biofuels, that was going to have a meaningful environmental impact. And as you are aware, and as I'm sure many listeners are aware, those environmental impacts have social and human health impacts as well. So it's not just one thing, but it's those impacts expand outward, right? So it was sometime into that experience of building that company and building and putting into the field the first ever prototype to do that in a working power plant, and doing the work of talking with people in the industry about why this was something that was going to be valuable for them, for their operations, for their power plants, for their manufacturing facilities, not just as a feel good, but as a valuable strategic initiative for their operation. In those conversations was when I first started to articulate this idea that what I was really doing was trying to find ways to put technology and the capital resources to bring technology out into the marketplace had real benefit to not just, a particular application or a particular field or a particular community, but that really served the greater good.
This podcast is brought to you by AdventuRISE, an online platform that provides one-on-one industry mentorship and career guidance tools.
Are you interested in connecting with experienced professionals and industry experts to learn more about your field of interest? Then AdventuRISE is a platform for you.
Follow AdventuRISE on LinkedIn at ADVENTURISE or on Instagram at ADVENTU.RISE. Or join our Discord community and our platform to help you find the mentors best suited to your needs.
For more details, check the link in our description. When you began, you talked about how you were initially interested in aeronautical engineering and also literature. How did you discover those?
In terms of the Aeroastro, I can't tell you how I conceived this idea that I wanted to be an astronaut. It just happened. Like, how do you discover your favorite color? I don't know. But by the time I was 14 or 15, I was really sure that that's what I wanted to do. I thought that I had this dream that could never be realized. It was just a fantasy. So I entertained all sorts of other ideas about what else could I do and what other kinds of careers might I have, and I thought about lots of other things that I thought I would enjoy doing. But fortunately, my parents were very encouraging, and my dad he had lots of sayings, one of which was, if you don't ask, the answer is already no. And so he said, if you want to be an astronaut, why not try? And, the worst thing is you don't get to be an astronaut. But if you don't try, you won't get to be an astronaut. So, and my mom also had always been very encouraging that, again, from her point of view, there's no guarantee that you get to do anything. So why not pursue the things that you really, really are excited about and that you care about and that are meaningful to you? And her point of view was, even if you don't get to be an astronaut, you may find yourself doing things that you find deeply rewarding by pursuing that passion and that interest. And so it was really their encouragement that that led me to go ahead and pursue that wildly improbable ambition.
It must have taken quite a bit of courage to do that, because at that time, not many people would be going for aeronautical engineering, right?
It was a fairly small major at MIT. I think probably still is. and there weren't very many women at MIT. But at the time, honestly, it didn't feel to me like a courageous thing. It felt to me more like a liberating thing. And maybe you felt something similar when you realized you could do something you really cared about. I mean, don't get me wrong, it was incredibly hard. And, there were some very miserable moments. But the idea that I could pursue something that I was really, really excited about was freeing and liberating, even when I was frustrated or when I, was struggling. Nevertheless, being able to do something that I was really, really excited about and that I had chosen because it was meaningful to me, that was empowering.
So how did you discover like combining technology and humanities and literature and what you learned from those things? How did that transition into a career?
And so the first thing I realized was that my literary studies had given me a scope of knowledge and reference ideas that had application to my work because it had application to the people I worked with. But the over time, the other thing that I realized that was an even deeper value is that, when you learn the engineering method, or you learn the scientific method, or you learn the journalistic method, or you learn any other professional method of engaging the world, right? You learn a way to think about a problem or an idea or, a phenomenon, right? And what I found is that those two ways of thinking gave me a lot of flexibility in problem solving and in design and in even conceiving the kinds of solutions we might pursue. Furthermore, it also gave me a comfort and facility with uncertainty that you don't learn in engineering, right? In engineering, we like things to be clear and defined exactly, and we're able to say that we know the answer, right? And what you learn in literary studies is a very different way.
There's so much, I think it's like celebrating uncertainty in a way. Science.
Exactly. It also not only gave me different ways to think and different ways to engage with my peers and colleagues, but it led me to different opportunities. And so I often advise young people to do exactly what you're doing, which is if you are really, really engaged in fields that seem like they have nothing in common, don't discard or disregard that. If you have the opportunity to pursue those parallel interests, do so, because not only are they connected because they're both resident in you, so they are connected in you, but also you will find that having those seemingly unrelated skills and experiences and perspectives will produce some unexpected benefit.
Actually, what you mentioned in the previous discussion about how pursuing your various interests, regardless of how different they may be, would give you new perspectives and understanding of situations. I really enjoyed that because I was reading a book called The Art of Thinking Clearly. And one of that is called The Confirmation Bias.
Yes.
And that's basically about how you can only understand in the things you know. you can't imagine what you don't know. So you have that restricted perspective. No, you're human, so you can't know everything.
Of course.
But being able to pursue all these different interests, if you have that opportunity, you should definitely take that, right?
My husband and I were listening to this long form radio program where the topic was language and specifically how we encode certain ideas in language, and how the way you think, of course, determines the way you talk or write, but importantly, the language that you primarily speak also very much shapes the way that you think. And so in this particular program, they were focused as an example on gender, right? And so in some languages, gender is part of everything, right? And in other languages, you don't have those same structures, right? And so they looked at how people thought about gender in highly gendered languages and in somewhat gendered languages and in minimally gendered languages. And it turns out that people actually thought quite differently. But then they also talked to people who were bilingual and multilingual, and they looked at how they thought, and the way that they thought varied quite a bit. And so then they went back and they asked people, why do you think this, right? And so for the people who were monolingual, in many cases, they said, well, that's just the way it is, right? But for people who were bilingual or multilingual, they said, well, in this context, it's the way that this language works, and in that context. And so, to your point, they had this much broader perspective of the possibilities.
Yeah,
Right?
that's so interesting. I think there's different levels of depth as well in even short phrases. They have completely different meanings based on what language it is, and nothing ever translates, right? So I can see how people would view a situation differently based on what language they're comfortable using or have knowledge about.
One of the things that I love is even within English, in American English, we have rain and we have drizzle, and that's about it. Mist, right? But if you talk to someone who's from Scotland, they have like 12 more kinds of precipitation. and so it also just opens your own awareness to how much more varied and interesting the world is, right? Because you're exposed to these very different ways of describing the world.
Yes, exactly. And I feel like as a kind of byproduct of learning languages, you also have a more understanding of the culture there, which I find to be really helpful in opening different arenas of thought. You mentioned that you co-founded a company. I'd love to hear about your entrepreneurial experiences.
I think it's important to acknowledge that we have, in just a very short span of time, really in essence, one generation, we have, not just in the US, but globally, we've adopted this idea of entrepreneurship in a way that was never so widespread historically. And my experience was in some ways quite representative. We started off, as many founders do, with an idea of how we wanted to bring a certain set of scientific and engineering insights to bear on a problem that we wanted to address. We knew very little about our customers, next to nothing. We knew very little about how we were actually going to make a working business out of providing that solution, or even what the solution would look like. Thought they were really brilliant ideas. They turned out to be okay ideas. But that's very typical. It's very typical to start off with a lot of ideas and not a lot of actual knowledge. And it took us about 2 years to even have a sufficiently well defined and well substantiated understanding of our very first customers to even get started, right? It really took like 2 years of talking to people and telling people our ideas and getting shot down and making pitches and making grant applications and, talking to power plant operators and in many cases, I look back on those conversations and I think, my God, like how many things I had completely wrong and how many things I totally didn't understand. And that's very typical, right? Like it's very typical to start off that way. And what's really, really important is to recognize that is normal, right? And that you are not going to just start off with your idea and everything is just gonna happen the way you imagine. It's gonna be, an overnight success. It really is a process of discovery and learning as fast as you possibly can, and adapting that learning as quickly as you and your teammates are able, so that you can find a solution that actually works. And above and beyond that, another thing that I found is if you are doing something which is unusual or out of the ordinary, then you have a much harder path because, again, most people you talk to have never thought about what you are offering or what you're hoping to offer. Again, if you are inquisitive about what they are thinking about and what their concerns are, particularly if we're talking about your customers, then you have an opportunity for a really mutually beneficial conversation. And that's really how to find your way forward. We also did get a fair bit of pushback just because not only did our company not sound like other companies, but we didn't look like other founder teams. And I had people say quite disparaging things to me, in some cases intentionally, explicitly biased. In other cases, they said things which I don't think they intended to be prejudiced or biased, but which nevertheless were. So for example, in the first case, I had people say to me, you can't possibly have done all the things on your resume, and what makes us think that you can do this, right? So explicitly biased, right? I mean, in essence, calling me a liar, right? That like I had made up the things that I had previously done. And so that therefore I shouldn't expect to have any credibility for what I was saying that we could do with this company. In the second case, I had people say to me, wow, that was a fantastic presentation. Who wrote it for you? So in the second case, they thought that they were like being encouraging, but they still didn't believe that I had done the work, right? And frankly, the founders of color I knew then and the founders of color I know now, women and men alike, face much harsher pushback. So it's important to know that going in, that first of all, you're just going to start off with this process whereby you think you have a fantastic proposition and you think it's going to be amazing and you think everybody's going to be excited about it. And maybe after you've done a lot more work, that will be true, but it won't probably be what you thought it was at the beginning, right? And that's just for everybody. But then also it's important to know going in that in addition to doing that work of learning and adapting and iterating and finding the people who actually are your customers, you're also going to have an extra set of let's call them prevailing resistance forces, right? So you're going to have a lot more pushback, and that's not to discourage anybody from starting, but it's just to say you want to go in with eyes open. You want to understand what you're undertaking. And a colleague actually, I thought put it brilliantly. She's a Black woman, and she said, look, you're going on a long journey and you have no idea what you're going to encounter. So pack heavy.
Yeah, that's really solid advice. And I love that you were realistic about it.
Yeah, and we have a lot of that kind of mythology, right? A lot of this heroic mythology. And the fact of the matter is that company that I told you about was a really great little company, and we did a lot of things really well, and we did a lot of things really poorly. And we did have the first ever system, the first ever emissions to biofuel system, to the best of our knowledge, in the world, installed at a working power plant, and a public utility power plant at that, which is a pretty high hurdle. And when the market imploded in 2007 and 2008, and all the project finance evaporated, our little company and countless other little companies were destroyed. It was an extinction event, like a meteor hitting the earth and killing off the dinosaurs. It was a wipeout, right? Who cares how empowering or inspiring your mission is? Who cares how much you care about it? Who cares how hard you've worked when there's no money, right? And so it's also important to not personalize your experience as an entrepreneur, either success or failure. And it's really important to recognize that, yes, as an entrepreneur, you have an outsized stake and an outsized influence. You have both the responsibility and the privilege of having that outsized role. However, you are by no means writing your own fate. There are so many other factors at stake. I think you're quite right in acknowledging how difficult it is to practice, right? And again, as human beings, we struggle with the disconnect between theory and practice in all aspects of our lives, right? Why should it be surprising that we should struggle when it comes to founding companies, right? One of my absolute favorite quotes of all time is attributed to Albert Einstein, but the quote is, in theory and practice are the same. In practice, they are not.
Do you, as a mentor yourself and as a mentee, were there any situations which stand out to you?
For me, what I really enjoy and find rewarding and compelling about mentoring is actually working with people who are really trying to bring forward, again, solutions that have the potential to have real beneficial impact. And most of the time, that interaction comes in the form of me asking questions. What if we envisioned the solution differently? How about if we thought about it from a different perspective? Or how could we rethink the boundary conditions? Are we applying constraints we don't have to apply? Sometimes what I'm trying to do with mentees is really to kind of help expand the solution space. And so sometimes I will offer, well, what if we did this? Or what if we tried that, right? Or could it be, right? But always it's in that hypothetical tense, right? I try really hard to never be prescriptive as a mentor, because that's not my role. As a mentor, I'm not directing. I'm encouraging, I'm supporting, I'm in some cases saying, I don't think that that's going to be a fruitful pathway forward. I encourage you to drop that. That looks like a dead end. I think you have enough evidence at this point to know that that's not going to be worth pursuing further. Because one of the things I believe very strongly is that we're far more effective problem solvers when we're asking questions, right? So as a mentor, I try really hard to ask questions that open up other questions and that lead to more insightful, more thoughtful, more strategically productive questions. What's exciting to me about being a mentor is that I get to see and support and I hope help really, really capable, bright, highly motivated people go do things that I would never think to do. Right? Yeah. And so for me to tell them what to do defeats the purpose.
I love that. Okay. Do you ever bring this into Reinventure Capital as and to investment decisions or scenarios like that, maybe as an entrepreneur itself?
Well, sure. So when we meet with founders, one of the very first questions I want to ask them is, what is their own personal objective or aspiration? What will success mean to them in the context of this enterprise, right? And I ask that, and I sometimes even say explicitly, I ask that in context of the knowledge that these are, again, very bright, very capable people who could be doing any number of other things, right? They could be pursuing any number of other career paths. They could be pursuing any number of other endeavors within those career paths. So having chosen this, something is their guiding aspiration, right? Something is important to them. And so I want to understand what that is. And I want to understand how that success is defined in their minds. How will they know that they have achieved what they aspired to, right? What will that mean? What will it look like? And then I want to understand, what are the things that they care about, and how are they thinking about their enterprise? How do they approach questions about their priorities or their specific market strategy or their specific hiring plans or whatever it might be? I'm much more interested in understanding how they think than what their current model looks like, right? And of course, we do want to understand their current model. It's important to understand that. But for us, it's very much more important to understand the mindset and the assumptions underneath that model, because what we are investing in is not the current model. What we're investing in is the future of this team and their collective proposition, right? And then of course we really want to understand, you know, what their own impact objectives are. You know, the venture community, generally speaking, prefers not to talk about impact. And many of my mainstream VC peers will say, look, it's hard enough to grow a company, you know, leave that impact stuff for later, make a lot of money and you can give it away, right? Like, just don't try to mix things up. Don't make it harder than it has to be. But one of the things that we know from experience and that has been substantiated in the literature is that companies that are organized around a guiding purpose do better. So we want to understand, for all of those reasons, we want to understand how the founder team thinks and how they approach their own priorities and their decision making and how they're thinking about the future. Because when we make an investment, we're committing to that future with them, and we're committing to doing everything we can to help them be successful in achieving that future. We want to make sure that we're working towards the same future, not two different futures.
Have you had any situations where, I know, shocking situations perhaps while you were having these questions or later on in the process?
So I will say that in my own experience prior to Reinventure, I had a quite shocking discovery where, not in that company we've already talked about, but in another instance, I thought that my co-founder and I had really deep and wide-ranging conversations about our objectives and our priorities, and I thought that we were aligned, and I discovered a couple of years in that actually we were not. And that was very shocking and very painful. And it happens. But nevertheless, when it happens to you, it's not fun. But we've had these conversations with founders where we've asked, you know, a 2-person or a 3-person founding team, for example, to tell us about their aspirations and their ideas of success. And it's come out in the conversation that they have very different aspirations and ideas of success, and they didn't know that.
Have you, from your experience, what did you think was most helpful for them to have a conversation? Like, it's obviously it's important to have that deep discussion about what their motivations are and what they expect to achieve. But besides conversations,
that's a really important question. So first of all, it is absolutely vitally important to have those conversations about not just what do we aspire to and what do we care about, but what do we expect from each other. You're starting a very complex endeavor that's relationship intensive, right? So it's really important to understand those expectations, but it's also really important to document them, because what happens is I say what I think and you say what you think, and each of us hears what we hear.
language thing.
That language thing, and the confirmation bias, right? Because I'm excited about working with you. I want to hear what I'm hoping to hear, right? So I will selectively hear the parts I want to hear, right? So it's really important to document that and make sure that you actually do have the same understanding. And also it's really important to make sure that you provide, both in terms of your relationship and your conversations, opportunities to continue having that discussion and continue revisiting it, but also to give yourself, as you said earlier, the realization that you may need to have an out, right? And I will say from my own experience, the reason that my own experience with that co-founder was so painful was because there wasn't an out. In our co-founder agreement, there was no provision whatsoever for either of us to be able to step away. And so and our attorney, I will say, had structured it that way on purpose because the attorney's point of view was it should be hard. And what I learned from that is that's the wrong way to think about it. The right way to think about it is to recognize that, yeah, it shouldn't be something that you do on a whim. Like you shouldn't just like, you shouldn't just like dissolve a partnership or walk away from a startup on a whim. But you should have a mechanism to be able to do that in a negotiated way, as opposed to by having to like tear apart whatever you've created, right? I try to share that with other founders to help them avoid having that same painful experience, right? Because again, it happens. It happens. We've only had about a generation of this huge shift, right? It's a very short amount of time in human experience to even have the experiential learning, let alone to integrate it and synthesize it and pass it along, right? So it's really important that we do that.
Yeah.
Because for all of us to learn the same lessons individually is ridiculous.
That's very true. I do have like a different perspective to offer on that. I definitely agree with you that things are moving so fast and developing so fast that there's no time like to be aware of every possible obstacle in your journey and like what mistake you could make. But like a different perspective is, even if it's been a really long time and you've discovered every possible scenario that could happen, sometimes too much structure isn't the best thing either, because you have a set way of thinking that, okay, you're not allowed to do this because you are going to bang your shin. You don't want to do that. And then you're afraid of veering off from the path.
No, I think you're exactly right. And for my own part, I'm someone who's always drawn to how do we do something that hasn't been done before, and that is very much the realm of entrepreneurship, or at least the part of the realm of entrepreneurship where I practice. And so you want to focus on making the mistakes that are specific to your endeavor and your set of discoveries, and not the ones that you can avoid, right?
Yes,
because those are things that are just going to slow you down, right? It's never going to be free of, unanticipated, unforeseen pitfalls and setbacks, and right, like it that's part of what makes it interesting and worthwhile, right? It's part of the allure and part of the appeal that it is a significant set of unknown or at least poorly foreseeable challenges.
Yeah. So yeah, thank you so much for being here. As a last question, do you have like a character or a song or a movie or something that you closely relate to?
So there are several characters I associate with very, very closely. I'm not sure if any of them would make a lot of sense in this context. But one I will mention is there's this recent science fiction series by, I mentioned Martha Wells earlier. There's this recent science fiction series by Martha Wells called The Murderbot Diaries. And the main character, the protagonist, is an artificial being. It's an AI with a mix of mechanical and biological body parts. And it has a very distinct voice. It doesn't want to be human. It doesn't aspire to be human. And nevertheless, it has some very close relationships with both AIs and humans. And one of the things that I find really fascinating about the fan base for these books is that Murderbot is very clear that Murderbot does not want to be assigned a gender. It thinks gender is creepy and sex is disgusting. And so it's very clear that it is an it. It doesn't want to be called he or she or even they. Like, I think that's just gross. But it's really interesting to me how across the fan base for these books, so many readers identify so strongly with Murderbot that they automatically project their own gender, right? And so going back, I think resonant with much of our conversation, not only do I really love that character, but I find it really interesting as a kind of illumination of people's own sort of expectations of someone they like being a reflection of them, right? So back to the idea of identity or confirmation bias, right? And I think this is it's a really fascinating thing. And for me, it's just a constant reminder to be paying attention to what is not me, right? And what I love about Murderbot is not like me. Murderbot is completely delightful. I adore this character. Yeah. And so, as I am looking at founders and companies and mentees and students, what I'm looking for is what's really interesting that's not me, right?
Yeah, thank you for your time. Thank you for sharing all your experiences and stories. And I really enjoyed our conversation.
Me too. I've had a great time. I've really enjoyed it. Thank you so much.